Thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome a wonderful performer, Constance Towers, who's also a good friend of mine. And thank you for coming out. She's in California, Beverly Hills, and she's speaking to us at about 4 o'clock your time. It's brutally hot out there, I hear.
Oh, it's so warm.
But the thing about Connie is he has an extraordinary career in 3 different mediums: the theater, films, and television, and each one has its own particular cult favorite. She seems to have been very good at choosing properties that were going to develop cult reputations in years to come. So it's hard to know where to begin. I'm going to start with my first introduction to Constance Towers, which was actually as a theater goer. So we'll start with the theater, then we'll go to movies, and then we'll go to TV. Cult favorites all the way down the line. The first time I saw Constance Towers was when I came to New York in 1965. And one of the first things I saw in the fall of '65 was a musical version of Anastasia called Anya. It was the last production at the old Ziegfeld Theater on 6th Avenue. And Constance Towers was Anya, and the Queen Dowager, the Dowager Empress, was played by Lillian Gish. And the show was directed by Mr. Broadway, George Abbott. I think the music was by Rachmaninoff. I remember it as good, but it somehow didn't go over. What happened, Connie?
Oh, so many things happened. You know, of course, it was my first Broadway show, and I was so in love with everything, and to be directed by the great Mr. Abbott, and then to have Lillian Gish. Today, I'm amazed, you know, you mentioned her name to a lot of young people, and they don't know who she was. But Lillian, yes, Lillian was absolutely a dream to work with. She was an iron butterfly. I don't know how old she must have been at that time, but she worked so hard. She was so professional. Every night at a performance, she was in the wings, sitting on a chair, in makeup, in costume, ready to go on in the first act. She didn't enter until the second act, but she was always sitting in the wings. And someone asked her, they said, "Lillian, why are you ready and you're down here, but you don't go on until the second act?" She said, "My darling, you never know what's going to happen, and I like to be ready." And she was ready to go on no matter what happened. And one thing that happened to her, we were doing our gypsy run through, the run through for the dancers and Broadway people. And it was just before we opened, and Lillian had this great wig, and she had this marvelous Russian fur hat on and her fur coat. And she was entering ahead of me down a little flight of stairs within, I guess we were in a house. And she went down this little winding flight of stairs to reach the stage, and then of course be exposed to the audience. Well, she tripped on the top stair and she literally somersaulted down the stairs. And when she landed on stage, she landed on her feet, and I marveled. Her wig, her hat, everything was perfect. And that was all I could think of was, oh, thank God, she didn't lose anything. She's perfect, she's perfect. When I told her that after the show, she said, "You didn't worry about me? You worried about my hat and my wig and my fur coat?" So she was just incredible.
But
and
iron butterfly is probably the right term. I mean,
oh, it is. She would bring me
nearly 100.
Well, she'd bring me food to the theater. She said, "You have to eat bran muffins." And so I ate her bran muffins. She made them and I ate them.
Was Mr. Abbott the wrong director for this material?
Oh, you know, it's so hard to say anything bad about him, but he was. And he came to my dressing room the night after we opened. We knew the show wasn't going to last long. The review was not a good review in the New York Times, and it was really all about him. It wasn't about the show even. It was really about Mr. Abbott. And some people said it's because he was involved with Gene Kerr and God, what was his name? The critic. He was married to Gene. Walter Kerr, right? Gene Kerr. That Walter Kerr was carrying a grudge against Mr. Abbott because of what had happened when Gene Kerr and he had done Please Don't Eat the Daisies, was it? I should know what that play was. But anyway, he really was cruel to Mr. Abbott. But he walked into my dressing room the night after we opened, and he looked at me and he said, you know, what's on that stage is my fault. And he said, maybe I wasn't the right one to have done this. And I thought that just took the biggest person in the world to be able to take that kind of criticism and then to process it and admit it. And he was, because, you know, it was so interesting when we were in rehearsal. Anastasia is a very deep, moving, emotional story, and it's Russian, and you've got Rachmaninoff's music. And the confrontation scene between the Dowager Empress and Anastasia is a very moving scene, as you know. And every time we got to the point of rehearsing that scene, he would go, get his briefcase, put on his coat, put on his hat, and he would leave. And I asked him one day, I said, where do you go? You leave us to stage this ourselves and to work it out. Where do you go? He said, I just can't take that kind of emotion.
Oh,
And isn't that interesting?
that's
And
very interesting, because the material is so emotional, but he was known for a different kind of theater and a different kind of directing.
That's right.
It wasn't about emotion. It was about timing and pacing and clockwork.
That's right. And the interesting thing that for an actor, and as I was so new to Broadway and to theater, and Mr. Abbott would always give you a line reading and then leave you. It was kind of like giving you the complete house with the roof on it. And then you had to go home and figure out, how did he build that house? How did he put all the bricks on top of one another to reach that result? So you had to really work twice as hard to try to find it. And his line readings generally were correct. They were where you really wanted to go, but you had to figure out how you got there, because he couldn't explain that to you. But if he knew
that wouldn't be the way some actors would care to work, to get line readings. He's the opposite of the method in the acting studio.
Yeah. I mean, and you really don't want a line reading, because it hampers you. You have to figure it out yourself, and maybe you'll get to that line reading or one that's better, maybe. But he knew, his ear was so perfect. When he was directing, he knew exactly what would make a scene work or not, or it wouldn't work, or what a line would do. He really was a genius.
For a certain kind
but he
of
lacked
theater.
Emotion.
He lacked, first, you realize, not having emotion, he lived to 107.
Maybe there's a secret.
There's a secret. Hal Prince.
Yeah, I think we need to figure that one out.
Well, I can tell you, Hal Prince once said to me, when I was doing my book on Hal Prince, if I can drop a name, he said, and this was years ago, he said, I know why Mr. Abbott lived to 107 and why I won't. He was stress-free, and I am not.
Isn't that interesting?
He said Mr. Abbott had no nerves, stress-free.
Oh, I agree with that. In George Abbott's biography, I read it, and autobiography, and he was talking about his first wife, and she had died, and he went to her funeral, and that was in Utica, New York, or someplace, and he got on a train to leave after he'd gone to her funeral. And when he was on the train, he listened to the sound of the wheels of the train turning, and he thought they said, you are free, you are free, you are free, you are free. That's what he took away from his wife's funeral, which to me really told me so much about him. Although one night he invited me to his apartment for dinner in New York during rehearsal. And I thought he said that Mr. Fellhaber and his wife were coming to dinner too. And when I arrived, he lived in a building on Fifth Avenue, Upper Fifth Avenue, that you took the elevator up to the floor and then you stepped into his apartment. So he greeted the elevator door as it opened, and I stepped off, and he was in his dressing robe. And I thought, gee, I guess I'm early. And so we sat down and we had a glass of whatever, I can't remember what it was, but and we chatted, and I waited for the Fellhabers to come, and they never came. And so we went in to sit down. He did go off, and he took off his dressing robe. I mean, didn't take it off in front of me. He went into another, whoops. He went into another, he came back and he had a dinner jacket on. And so we sat at the table. He sat at the head of the dining table. I sat to his right. And we talked about the show. It was a great opportunity to have the director's ear and talk to him about certain directorial things that I was hoping might change, or that I could inform him how I felt about things. And finally, at the end of dinner, I realized, I asked him about the Fellhavers, and he said, oh, they couldn't come. I invited them, but they couldn't come. And so I grew a little nervous and wondered what was the dessert and was hoping it wasn't me. And so I told him, I said, you know, I just have a terrible headache and I really have to go home because I've got to be back at rehearsal tomorrow and I don't feel well. So he was very nice about it. He walked me to the elevator, did not take me downstairs, did not take me to the doorman and secure a taxi cab for me. I had to do all that myself. So I went home, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. And so I thought, you know, he invited me there. He knew they weren't coming. And he didn't even pay for my taxi cab when I went home. And so the next morning I went into rehearsal, and he came over to me and he said, we'll have lunch today. And I said, terrific. I'd love to have lunch with you. So we went to the local deli, whatever it was, around the Ziegfeld Theater. And we sat and we had lunch. And when the bill came, I picked the bill up and I handed it to him. And he said, what's this for? And I said, that's for my taxi cab last night. And that's for this and for that and so on. And he just threw his head back and laughed, and he paid the bill. And we went back to rehearsal.
And you were fine in rehearsal.
Oh, yeah.
They're on.
Oh, yeah.
Fine.
I mean, that's the kind of wonderful character that he was. And you could treat him that way. But
After the disappointment of Anya, I saw you in your next show. And folks, I have to tell you, everybody out there listening, this woman stopped the show in a way I had never seen before. And in the 50 plus years since, I haven't seen. Constance Towers as Julie in Showboat at Lincoln Center in 1966 stopped the show cold. And the audience cheered. You had to come back and do an encore of that number. Tell us about that.
Well, nobody was more surprised than I was, but Larry Kasha, who was the director, said, Connie, I want you to come back. If the applause is overwhelming, come back. And first, the direction was leave your purse on top of the upright piano. It was the guy was playing the piano, and I sat up on the piano and then got off the piano and came around and leaned on the piano, then went over to the curtain to exit, and then because he was just my Bill, and went off. And well, the night before we opened, the applause was something I just had never heard before, and I have to tell you, it was the greatest thrill ever to have an audience just demand that you come back. And
we did, I can tell you. We demand.
But you know, it was a moment you hope you have one of those in your entire life, and a lot of people don't. And the fact that I did was just, oh God, I can't tell you, it was so wonderful. So I was instructed, go back because you left your purse. You're going back to pick up your purse that you left there, and kind of stop, and then do it again. Do the chorus of My Bill. He's just my Bill. And so that's exactly what I did. And most of the critics wrote about that it was such a wonderful way to incorporate an encore without it just being an encore. And I went off, and the stage manager told me, he said, you have to go back out. And I said, I can't. I don't know what to do. And I was so naive in the sense that I didn't know what to do. And I said, I did my encore. I can't do another one. And he literally pushed me back out. And I'm standing there, and with all of that applause and demand, I just sang it again on opening night. And then I went off and I said, don't ask me to do it again because I won't do it. But it was, oh God, it was just one of the greatest thrills ever.
But when the first preview happened, you weren't expecting the number, that kind of reaction.
No, and it was just such an incredible reaction. I mean, that kind of sound from the audience was deafening, and
It is
frightening.
the greatest showstopper I have ever seen. That
God,
was a
from
showstopper.
you, that's a huge compliment.
That was a showstopper.
Thank you.
Now, then your next theater, you pick them. The next show was not so successful, though it sounds fascinating. Folks, can you believe this? Constance Towers starred as what's her name? Kitty Fremont.
Kitty Fremont.
The heroine, a musical version of Exodus called Ari, and that, I think it's fair to say, was not a success.
No, it wasn't.
What happened?
What happened? Well, first of all, Leon Uris was a great author, but he was not a playwright. And that was a very serious mistake because he should not have tried to write a Broadway show. And he brought a skiing friend with him, Walt Smith, who had written some songs and played in a bar in Aspen, I think it was Aspen. And he had no idea, neither one of them. And people, it's like people today think they can just go on television and act. Well, you can't. You have to learn how to do that. You have to have a talent to do that. And he had neither. And he came to me and asked me to come down to we were in Philadelphia, and he asked me to go to the ladies' lounge and sit with him for a minute and talk to him about how I felt about the show. So we sat down, and I tried to be as honest and forthright with him as I could be, but I obviously said all the wrong things. I told him that, a scene has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and none of these scenes do. They just don't, there's no way to progress to the next thing in the show. And so he listened, and he never spoke to me again. I went back into rehearsal, and Leon Uris never, I was the invisible Kitty Fremont, that he just wouldn't talk to me. And it was a cast of wonderful talents. Gosh, John Savage, who was just one of the great actors, the young man then, and has been silently, he's an actor's actor. And everybody else in the show, they were all wonderful. But the show failed, and even my husband came to Washington, D.C. and drove me home after the show, and he said, Connie, you got to get you have to leave. You can't stay in the show. And I said, I can't do that. These are wonderful people. It's Christmas. How can I just get up and leave? And so I didn't. I stayed with it and came in to Broadway, and it did not fare well. But it was an unfortunate show that had a great story, wonderful actors, all of the possibilities possible. And it was just the wrong people trying to do it. And our producers, oh God, I can't remember their names. They came into rehearsal with both in a brand new mink coat. And they said, look, we just bought one for our mother and we've got new mink coats too. And I thought, yeah, but what do we pay? How do we pay somebody to write a new song if one of these songs doesn't work or whatever? But they didn't have any idea what they were doing either.
Was the score, Connie, were the songs
it had a couple of songs in it that were really, I thought, quite good songs. But they took one out that I liked, and they put in for Kitty a song called Give Me One Good Reason. And I can't tell you how I thought, give me one good reason why I'm singing this song or why I'm here. Oh God, that was just one of those hopeful things that you do, but that show did not work.
But you knew coming in that this was a no-go.
Yeah, I was hoping above hope, being positive. Pollyanna, this will work, it's going to do it. And it didn't happen.
But then your next show was an extraordinary triumph, and it gave you years of employment. You were Anna to Yul Brynner's King in The King and I on Broadway and on tour. Am I right that you did the show with Yul Brynner for 3 years?
Yeah, it was 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah. We were on Broadway for 2. We were on the road before we opened for 6 months, and then we were on the road for 6 months after. So we had 3 years together. And Yul, when he was going to do another tour, called me. He wanted me to go with him, and I loved him so much. And I wanted to go on that other tour, but I just knew I had been away from my family for 3 years, away from my husband for 3 years. So he was so wonderful when I was on Broadway. He was commuting practically every weekend back and forth. And he did everything in his power to make it work, and he did. But I couldn't do that to him again. So I didn't go. And instead I stayed and did a television series. So
What was it like doing the same show night after night for 3 years? How did you keep it fresh? Or were you able to be interested in it every time? Did you ever feel you were at a point where you were doing it by rote or phoning it in?
no, I never,
Never
ever,
felt
ever.
that?
No, because you're standing in the wings. You're 24 hours older than you were the night before when you did it before. So you're not the same person. And it's a different audience. It's totally different vibe from the audience. The orchestra's 24 hours older. And Milton Rosenstock, who was our wonderful, talented, incredible director, music director in The King and I, he just made it come alive every night. But I think the most important thing that happened during the run of that show was Yule. And Yule Brynner would come to the theater at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so would I. And we would go into his dressing room, sit down, have a cup of tea, and we would talk about the night before. And he would always tell me, you know, darling, this could be different, or maybe I'll try to stand up and maybe the laugh will be bigger, or this part of it will work better, or whatever. And I learned very quickly that I could get any change I wanted in the show that I wanted if I merely approached him and said, you know, Yule, do you remember during rehearsal when you suggested that we try that I come from left instead of right, or whatever it was? And he would sit there and say, darling, no, tell me about that. So I would tell him what I'd like to try, but that it was his idea, and he would say, marvelous, let's try that. But if I had sat there and told him, gee, I've got a great idea, he would have said, no, that won't work.
Now, did you detect in him any time where he got bored doing this?
Never. Oh, never.
Never got bored with the show.
He loved that show so much. And my husband even laughed. He said, you know, it's becoming about the bows. He kept adding things to the bows, gongs and stances. And he would walk down and stand there for 30 minutes if he had to will that audience to get on their feet. And they never failed him. He always got the audience on their feet. And he kept telling me,
was he at the top of his game every performance?
He gave 150% of himself.
Every time.
He never walked through a performance. His life started when that overture started and he got in place. His day was beginning and he loved it. He just lived for it. And he brought new things. He was always, and that was what was wonderful about our little cup of tea and talking before the performance, that he would bring new ideas and fresh ideas. So the performances were never the same. And we always had a new project. And he had the most delicious sense of humor, which probably would surprise a lot of people who have heard all the ugly stories about Yul Brynner being demanding and nasty. And so I never saw that.
You never saw any of that?
Oh, I never saw that. The only time I ever saw him lose his temper or be impatient or demanding with someone is if someone wasn't giving 100%. That's all he asked of everybody in the company. He would meet with the company and give them a pep talk. And we'd all go back to our dressing rooms and go out to do a better performance than we did the night before. He was a dream. And I was his Mrs. Anna, and he treated me with all of the respect and dignity that I could ever hope for. And when he thought he had insulted me one night on stage, which was not true, but he had always said that the king points. No one else points, the king points. And the king has this 3 feet of space around him. And of course, Mrs. Anna had a self-imposed circle around her. And he said, but no one points but the king. And I guess I did something where I pointed my finger and he went on stage. And I realized what I had done. On stage. And of course, but it fit the king. You know, it was not out of character.
Yeah.
So he thought he had insulted me. He was just certain that he'd broken my heart. So the next day was a matinee day, and I came into the theater, got to my dressing room door, and there were all the little children in the show were all standing there, and they were out of breath at what was at my door. It was a quince tree in full bloom in a pot. So it was about a 6-foot full bloom quince tree there with a beautiful big note that said, "My favorite, my darling Mrs. Anna, please, I did not mean to hurt your feelings, your adoring king." And so I looked at that and I thought, and one of the little boys asked me, he said, why did he give you this? And I said, well, the king thinks he hurt my feelings last night, so he sent me this gift. And the little boy stood there for a minute and he said, well, what are you going to do this performance? He'd figured it out. He thought, boy, she's going to pull this one again. But that was Yule. Or he went into 21, and I just remarked with his wife, Jacqueline, we were looking in the counter at 21, and I said, gee, that suitcase that has all the picnic dishes and forks and spoons, isn't that fun? Wouldn't it be fun to have that? And it had 21 logo on the outside of it. And so he overheard me say that. The next day at my dressing room door, there was the suitcase, and I still have it.
Really?
Yeah.
How wonderful.
So he did everything to make you feel beautiful. If I got the audience up in a standing ovation before he came out, he would walk out and he would kind of say little things to me as he went by me and mutter. But then afterward, he'd say, you see, I've taught you how to do that. You see, now you know how to do that. But he was thrilled if I could get the audience up. So it was never competitive in a negative way. It was only
if you did well, he did well. It made him look better. If you were good,
that's right.
Yeah. Okay, now we make.
Yeah. Anyway, he just made it a delight. I loved him with all my heart.
Wonderful stories and terrific theater stories. Now we make a quick segue to movies. And as you know, you're in 4 of my favorite films, 2 each by great directors. But I'm going to surprise you by my first question, because we've never talked about this before. You were in Blake Edwards' first movie.
That's right.
Bring Your Smile Along, which
that's right.
Only the brilliant film historians among us, and we have a few in the audience. You know, Connie, some of us in the audience saw Ari, so you're not dealing with slouches here. We're very well informed. There are Ari veterans in the audience listening tonight, but I have some film friends who are listening who know everything, so they would know about Bring Your Smile Along. But that's an obscure 1955 movie from Columbia, directed by Blake Edwards and starring Frankie Lane.
That's right, and Keith Purcell.
Right,
and it was written by Blake.
Yes.
And Dick Quine. They both collaborated on the script, and then it was the first time that Blake had ever directed anything. And I was at a dinner that some friends gave for Julie and for Blake before he died. And he came, and my toast that evening was, well, the gentleman who gave the party had, when I was in Mexico and needed money to help orphans for medical problems that they had, this man happens to have had the Stein Institute, Eye Institute, and I had a boy with a retina that was detached. Boy, I just made one phone call and he arranged for a teaching grant. It was a terribly expensive operation and my little project could not afford it. He made it possible. So when I got up and toasted them, I said, I'd like to toast Blake Edwards for being my first director ever. I'd never been in front of a camera before, and I didn't know left side of camera, right side, or whatever. I didn't know anything. And Blake was the man who kept me from running into other actors when I was trying to exit a scene. So he was wonderful to me. I just could not have been luckier than have him be my first director. He was wonderful.
Did you have any sense that he was really talented, though, and he might go on to major things? Was there a gift there?
No, I didn't know he was going to go on to do Pink Panther and all of these, Tiffany's, Breakfast at Tiffany's, and all of these incredible films that he did. But he he was such a likable, sweet, kind of country boy. And he was delightful to work with. And he just took me by the hand and taught me how to get out of a scene, where to look when I was looking supposedly at the camera, but to go to the side of the camera. He taught me so much that I was always going to be grateful to Blake. And he was a very, very nice man. And I think Julie was the first person to say that she was so lucky to be married to him, because he was fun and he had a great sense of humor. And I think that was part of the success of their marriage, was that they just laughed a lot.
What about Frankie Lane? He was a wonderful singer, but acting perhaps not.
That was not his long suit. He should have sung more. And Keith Purcell was difficult too. I mean, that was my first experience with people who were more interested in being on the phone than doing the work they were hired for. And Keith was always on the phone. And they always had to wait for him. They'd have a scene set up and they'd wait because he was on the phone. And Frankie Lane, Frankie worked hard at it, but he just, I don't think he was ever going to be an actor.
No.
And, you know, I don't think he understood what it was to be an actor. And so he just played what he played. He played Frankie Lane.
But he was a terrific singer. He was a terrific.
Oh, he was great.
Singer.
God, Mule Train, and all those wonderful songs.
A great pop singer.
Yeah.
Now,
and he was great.
You did two films directed by the legendary John Ford. The Horse Soldiers with William Holden, and a film that people might not know, but it sure is timely today, Sergeant Rutledge.
Gives me chills just to hear it. Yeah. That was
deals with racism.
Well, absolutely. But you know who was far ahead of his time was John Ford. John Ford loved Black people. He was all for equality and all for, you know, so you're Black, you're brown, you're yellow, whatever. That doesn't matter. Be talented. Play the part. And Woody Strode, who was the famous football player, and Woody adored John Ford, and John Ford adored him and made him a movie star. But the thing that somebody, I guess it was Mrs. Ford who told me that he would, you know, he took to his bed. He's very Irish. And so in the afternoon, he would go to bed. And then he might get up for dinner, or he might just have dinner in bed. And so if you wanted to see him, you went over and sat beside him on the bed or on a chair at the bed and talked to him. And so the way to get him to read a script was if you put the script on the bottom of the pile of scripts by his bed, he would think that somebody put the script on the top to trick him into reading that one. So he would always take the one from the bottom. So Sergeant Rutledge was called the Buffalo Soldiers first. And that script was on the bottom of the pile. And they knew he would love it because it was the story of Black men freed from the Civil War, and they were absorbed into the United States Cavalry. And that Buffalo Cavalry unit performed some of the bravest acts of courage in the history of the cavalry. And so when he read this story, and it's a story about a Black man who is falsely accused of raping a white girl, and it's a tough story because you've seen it, and it takes place in the courtroom mostly, and it really was the beginning. And you know, they couldn't show that picture. The picture didn't do well domestically because they couldn't show it in the South.
No, it didn't do well, and it still doesn't have anywhere near the reputation that it should. It's a late Don Ford film. It's a very important film, and not to say also beautifully directed and acted. It's really a work of art, but it's not so well known. How did you get to Ford? He hired you for Horse Soldiers, and then he liked you, obviously, hired you for the next film. What was the connection between you?
Well, actually, I was singing in New York in the Persian Room of the Plaza Hotel, and this was right after Columbia. And Harry Cohn, I went and saw him and said, I want to leave, and he let me leave. So I thanked him, and he said, what are you thanking me for? And I said, well, I'm thanking you that you're letting me go, because if you'd had any plans for me, you wouldn't have let me go. So thank you. So I went back and sang in the Persian Room at the Plaza Hotel, and Martin Rackham, who was producing The Horse Soldiers, saw the opening night of that and wanted me to come back to Hollywood and to meet John Ford. So I came back to Hollywood and went in to meet Mr. Ford, and he said, well, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Whitefish, Montana. And he said, well, what is your family? This name Towers, is this your real name? And I said, well, it's my father's adopted name, but my father's real name was Murray. And he said, are you Irish? And I said, yes, my family comes from County Cork. And my father was born in Ireland, born in Drumcondra. And so he immediately had a rapport with me because I was Irish. And my family came from Ireland. And so I think it put me on a slightly different level talking to him in the beginning than it might have if I'd just been, if I'd been the name Towers, which is English. That would have been not so good. But anyway, he tested me with 5 other ladies, and I was just lucky enough to get the part. And then found myself on location in Louisiana with John Wayne and William Holden, and that wonderful, wonderful Irish company that he had of just the greatest.
Stock company.
Oh God, and were they wonderful? They were just so wonderful. I had 2 stuntmen, Slim Hightower and Freddie Kennedy, and they rode everywhere with me because insurance demanded that, but I was riding side saddle. And that's a whole story too. John Ford asked me in the beginning when he interviewed me, he said, you know, you ride side saddle in this film. I said, yes. He said, you know how to do that? I said, absolutely. I'd never seen a side saddle. I didn't know what that was. So I went home and he said, well, we'll see about that. And he said, I want you at the Ford Ranch in the Valley tomorrow afternoon, and we'll see how well you ride a side saddle. And I walked out and I thought, oh, what I've done to myself this time, Ollie. And so I went to the yellow pages in the Hollywood phone book, and I found that there was a woman who taught side saddle. So I called her and I said, I need to learn how to ride a side saddle this afternoon. So she said, well, come on out. So I went out and she put me through till dark that night. We worked and worked and worked, and I mounted, dismounted, rode a gallop, did everything I had to do, and went home. I was so sore I could barely get into bed. And so the next day I went out to his ranch, and Pappy was there, and all the stuntmen were there, and all these wonderful Hollywood horses, and they put me on a side saddle, and I managed to get through it like this. I had saddle sores. I mean, my body, I really put it through something over 48 hours. And so they gave me a big box and big bow on it. And I opened it up, and it was a gift from John Wayne and John Ford. And in it were Band-Aids, liniment, salves, everything. So they kind of let me know that they knew what I had done.
Was John Ford crabby at all? Because he was famously supposed to be
sure.
crabby.
Oh, God. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
He could be very crabby.
Very
But you just had to go along with it. I mean, you had to laugh and enjoy it. I mean, one day he rode by me and he was really crabby, and he very early in the morning went by me and he said, gotta go to the bathroom. And so I don't think he called it the bathroom. He called it not the head. He had another name for it. But anyway, so he went in, and I happened to be around when he came out, and he rode by me and he was cursing. And so I looked at him, I said, is there something wrong? And he said, had my long underwear on backwards. So he was a character, and you never quite knew what he was planning. He was very clever, sly Irish. He loved to stir the pot. He was always pitting somebody against somebody. And I saw him do that. And you know the famous stories of like Long Gray Line, I think it was Ward Bond and Tyrone Power, that he went to Tyrone Power and said, you know, Ward Bond said that you can't act, so you've got to really work on this scene so that you can do it better. And then he went to Ward Bond and told him something equally inflaming. And so then he went to the prop master and had the prop master, they were going to fight this scene in the next day, and it was going to be in mud. He got the prop master to fill the area with horse manure. So when the two men started to shoot the scene and they fell into the manure, they realized that they'd been tricked by Ford. First they were mad at one another, and then they fought it out because they were mad at John Ford.
So he had tricks up his sleeve, lots of tricks.
Oh, all the time.
All the time.
You never knew. And I found out one not too long ago that he played on me that I didn't know about. And it was in Sergeant Rutledge. And there is a scene where there is a young black man of color, who is a soldier, and he's in my arms, and I'm pouring water over his face. He's wounded, and I'm giving him water, but I'm also pouring the water over his face. And this boy I thought he was wonderful. And I ran into him. He's now a man. And he came to me and he said, "You and I did Sergeant Rutledge together." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "I was that young man that you had in your arms. And did you know that John Ford told me that you hated Black people?" And I said, "What?" That's absolutely not true. And he said, "I kind of figured that out for myself." But he said, he told me that, and that's why I was so afraid in that scene. I was so afraid of you.
So
look what he did to me.
Manipulate, yes, to get what he needed. He was a manipulator.
Anything that would work.
Did you see him?
And then I got mad at him because I said, trust me as an actress. You should know that I can deliver that. I don't have to have you make me cry before I cry. So.
Did you notice anything between him and John Wayne? Did you notice how they reacted to each other at all?
Well, it was a very interesting relationship because John Wayne worshiped John Ford. John Wayne, that was his coach. And he longed for any word of encouragement, any word of praise from John Ford. That meant the world to Duke Wayne. And, here's this big movie star. He's handsome. He's got everything in the world that he could possibly want, but he wanted praise from John Ford. It was more than anything in the world.
And was John Ford stingy in giving that praise?
He would give it to him after a scene was played out. And one day he turned to him and he said, "Gee, your son must have coached you on that scene. That was pretty good."
He could give praise.
He could give it, but he didn't give it often.
Now, the next director is a very different personality, Sam Fuller. But you loved him, I know. You were crazy about him personally.
Oh, absolutely.
But Sam Fuller cast you in roles that I never would have thought of you for. In Shock Corridor, you're a stripper. And in Naked Kiss, you're a prostitute.
I guess that's the way he saw me.
I mean, we could cast a prostitute, real hard-bitten type. Let's go to Constance Towers. No.
Well, you know what he did? He wrote me in every scene of that film. And he wanted, I think, Sammy never said this, but I always felt that he just wanted to give me that challenge as an actor. And fortunately, he believed in me that he felt that I could do it. He was so different than John Ford. John Ford was a gentleman who had some breeding. He knew how to have tea in the afternoon, and everybody on the set had tea. There was a gentility about him. And Sammy was raw, crude, brilliant, a savant. He never went to school, but his house was lined with books. There wasn't a room in his little house that didn't have bookcases, and they were all books that he had read. And he knew everything in any book. You could pull anything off a shelf, and he could tell you about it. And he wrote that way. And the quotes at the end of his films, the quotes were always Socrates or, some great thinker that he would have a quote that was sort of his inspiration for the story. And at heart, he was a newspaper man. So he was he wrote that way.
He wasn't hard-bitten in person.
No.
He was not hard-bitten.
Oh, no. He was a gentle, sweet, unpredictable, sort of not awkward exactly, but he was just totally uninhibited. And that's why he could direct those children in Naked Kiss in the way that he did. He got on the floor with them and he was just one of them. And they all sang in that little song that we sang.
Yeah.
And he could get a performance out of someone because he had that ability of just of understanding you and getting inside your heart. And I loved working with him. And he was unpredictable. He had a gun that had blanks in it, but every now and then he'd shoot the gun off. And that would kind of concentrate your mind for a moment. And I asked him, I said, why do you do that? He said, well, I didn't have your attention. So I...
Oh. Did he ever ask you to do anything? Because he asks a lot of you in The Naked Kiss. It's a very raw, daring, even sort of startling performance. Nothing has no connection to who you are.
No.
I mean, that character is a million miles away from you. Did he ever ask you to do things that you thought, I can't do this? Or you trusted him no matter what he asked?
I did trust him. The only thing, I think I told you this, in fact, that I regret every time I see the movie is we talked about Goethe when Kelly, who is proud of the fact that has a little education and she likes to use it. And she uses the description of it was whatever it was that it was Goethe, but we decided she wouldn't know how to say that. So she says Goethe in the film. And every time I see it, I think, that bothers me so much because I bet she knew how to say that. And it's to hear it not pronounced correctly, I always wish, that's one of those things about film, you can't go back and redo it. On stage, you've got the next night, so you can go in there and try it a different way.
You feel the character, as you understood her, would know how to pronounce Goethe.
Yeah, she knew everything else. I just can't believe it. Yeah.
Would have made that mistake. Okay, I'm looking at the clock and want to go very quickly. But as you know, I was a huge fan of your husband, John Gavin.
Right.
And I told you, I think I can be honest, I love Imitation of Life, and it's my favorite film practically. And I did host screenings. We tried to get Mr. Gavin to come to the Cinematheque. We tried to get him. No way of ever getting him to make a personal appearance. He wouldn't do it.
No,
Why?
he wouldn't.
He wouldn't appear as John Gavin actor. He wouldn't.
Well, he was very private, and everything for him was very personal. And he loved his early career of acting, felt that he was just the most fortunate guy in the world, but he wasn't comfortable. And I have a feeling that for him to appear before a crowd of roaring fans and talk about a film and being an actor would just be too hard for him. That the happiest I've ever seen him in his life was when he was the US ambassador to Mexico. That was a challenge that he really loved. And it was something he was totally prepared for. He went to Stanford University. He wrote his final paper on Latin American affairs. He was a student of Latin America. So he was so prepared to go to Mexico and do a job, and he did. He went there, he was challenged. The Mexicans were not kind to him when he first got there because he said this is going to be a mutual respect, and you have to respect the United States as much as we are going to reach across the border with a handshake of friendship. And I mean, the first thing that he did when he got there, they were in a terrible financial crisis. And he went to Washington immediately to get a big loan for Mexico. And in Mexico, the newspapers were writing, absent ambassador, first 5 weeks of his appointment, where is he? He's in Washington. Well, he was in Washington trying to get them money, which he did and brought back. So it was a gradual time that he had there where Mexicans know, you talk to them and they say he was one of the greatest ambassadors they ever had. And he was. Because
was he good with people, Connie? Was he good on a one-to-one and meeting and greeting people?
Oh, absolutely. He could charm you to death, but he really liked people, and he loved intelligence. And when he met with his first meeting with President Lopez Portillo in Mexico, was they immediately liked each other. And he had a very charming, wonderful way of reaching out, but he was bright. He was intelligent. And so you walked away and you'd had a substantive conversation. It wasn't just social, but you really talked about things that were essential and important.
Did he look back at his film career, or was it the past? I mean, he didn't talk about it.
That's interesting. It was he said, of course, when he was in Washington and having his hearings before the committee to go to Mexico or not to be a future ambassador, and they said, well, we understand that you have been a movie actor. And Jack said, well, I would question that word actor, and I have 20 films that would prove that I wasn't. So he got, and of course, they all laughed, and then he was approved, and there was no problem. But his film career, he was proud of it. He was proud of certain films like Thoroughly Modern Millie. He loved that film, and I love it too. I think it's wonderful. Mad Woman of Chaillot, which really has never been seen by many people, and he was brilliant in that. His agent, Paul Kohner, kept saying, Academy of Ravard, that he thought that, that Jack would be nominated for his performance.
Look, he was in Psycho, probably Hitchcock's masterpiece. He was in Imitation of Life, the greatest melodrama ever made in America. And he was in Spartacus,
Backstreet,
epic,
Spartacus,
directed by Stanley Kubrick. Not too shabby.
Not
too bad.
I mean, all of his films. And as he says, you watch his films and you see him starting to learn. When he started out, he didn't know what he was doing. Both of us. He didn't know what he was doing either. And Time to Live and A Time to Die was his first big film. But I guess there were 2 or 3 others before that where he says he just hopes nobody ever sees them because he was running into the camera too. But he learned on the job, and because he was so bright. God, he's just one of the most intelligent human beings.
Connie, did he ever feel that he owed his film career to the fact that he was so extraordinarily good looking?
I think he
cast him because he was so handsome.
I think he hoped that it was more than that.
Of course.
He was always embarrassed if someone told him he was good looking. He never really, I don't think he ever really got it, that he was that good looking. Women would fawn over him. And yet, he hated smoking, and I'd see a lady sit down next to him. She was going to be his dinner partner. And I'd see her take out her gold cigarette case and her gold lighter, and she'd put them beside the plate. And I knew what was going to happen. He would turn to her and say, are you going to smoke those? And she would say, well, only between courses. And she was so smitten with John Gavin. And he would say, well, I hope you have a lovely dinner. He would get up and ask his hostess to change his place.
Oh my God.
So I told him, I said, you can't do that. And he said, yes, I can. And in Mexico, the residents had big signs. This is before it was a popular thing to do. And he would have big signs in the residence, no smoking. People were not allowed to smoke in that residence or at the embassy. So
was he proud of his time on Broadway in Seesaw? He had a good singing voice, didn't he? He had a good voice.
Oh my God. He was born singing. I had to take singing lessons. I took acting lessons. I just went, every day I was taking something to learn to do something better. Jack just opened his mouth and sang, and it was beautiful. Richard Rodgers said, gee, I like your guy. He really sings well. And he did. And Michael Bennett took Jack and treated him like a football player to teach him to dance. He would lay out a dance as if it was a football play, and then Jack could do it. And he if you saw him in Seesaw, he was adorable. He danced. He was so cute and did it so well. But he was so proud of that show, and he loved Lucy Arnaz and Michelle. They both were just great.
Did he like being live? Did he like performing live in front of an audience?
Oh, he loved it. He loved it. Yeah, because that's the thrill of all, is that applause. Immediate acceptance is just incredible.
My last question before we open it to the house. You've pulled off a very commendable trick. Your character on General Hospital is dead, but she appears in the show still. How did you manage that?
Well,
they killed you off.
I know, they killed me off 4 times.
Oh.
My grandson pushed me off a cliff. I came back and somebody said, "How did you do this?" And I said, "I don't know, one mighty burst of adrenaline," and walked off. And that was it, and the audience accepted it. And then I was poisoned, and Luke shot me right through the heart. And when they made a hole in this beautiful jacket, I thought, God, when they destroy the wardrobe, I'm really dead. I mean, they wouldn't do that. But I came back. But what they do with me now is that people have nightmares. And in the nightmare, it's me.
Oh,
and
it's you.
it's me. And I talk to them, and they ask me questions about, somebody recently, I had a scene with an actor, and he was questioning who his mother was. Well, it turned out it was me. And I'm his mother. And so that was his nightmare. He woke up and found out that Helena was his mother. So that colored his life for him. And
it's a character you love to hate.
That's right. And I thought when I first started to do this part, actually Elizabeth Taylor created the part years ago. Back in like 1980, they brought her on as Helena Cassadine. And then she lasted for, I guess, 3 or 4 performances and was wonderful. And everybody loved her, but she was not going to do that for a career. So then the character was sort of dormant. They always talked about her, but she never came back. And then they decided to bring her back. So they brought her back as a tall, blonde, thin. I mean, I don't think I look like Elizabeth Taylor. But it's been a wonderful part to play. And it was very challenging because I had never played anything but the character that's as pure as driven snow, except for the prostitute.
Sam Fuller, yeah.
Yes. And so this challenge has really been fun.
You're still on it, aren't you? You're still
yes.
doing. You're still on.
Oh yeah. Well, I don't know, with the pandemic and everything.
But all things being equal, you will appear in some future nightmare.
Probably. Oh yeah, I'll come back. I'll probably be the virus. Probably. It's somebody's nightmare. I'll be blowing on them, sneezing.
Mark, I think we can open it for questions. I know that.
Sure. I have a few here. One is asking you to talk about your film, The Relic.
Oh dear. Okay. You want me to talk about The Relic? My son says, "Gee, you had the title role, Mother, The Relic." He's out of the will. It was an interesting experience. I finally ended up being killed by the monster and eaten by beetles, in not the singing beetles, but actual scientific beetles. And I understand that movie was so popular in Europe and has made a huge amount of money. And I don't think it did very much in the United States. But it was fun to do. I loved the director, and it was Peter, and I can't think Peter's last name at the moment, but he was charming. And so it was a different kind of movie than I'd made before, sort of a horror movie in a way, but it was fun.
Contrary to that, the next question is how do you keep in such great shape and beautiful and youthful looking?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm only 39. I mean, anyway, I didn't hear any applause on that. I didn't hear a reaction.
They're all muted.
Actually, no, I try to eat healthy. And my husband did too. And then I have a trainer who comes, and he's been coming for 20 years, comes 3 times a week, and he's wonderful. And then I also do Pilates every morning at about 5:30 in the morning. I have a wonderful girl who comes to me, and we're in my garage, and we do Pilates, and we're stretching, and then I walk. And I live in the part of Beverly Hills that's very hilly, so when I go out and walk for an hour, I've really gone up and down and sideways. So it's basically that's what it is. And I don't smoke, never have. I don't think my husband would have married me if I'd been smoking. And I don't particularly drink. So I think I just maintain a healthy regimen.
Okay. From Bruce, we have, do you have any recollections or stories to share about the shows that you did at the Jones Beach Theater on Long Island?
Well, that was wonderful. Jones Beach is an outdoor theater that has an island way out, and then it has a big moat in the front, and then there is the stage, and then the orchestra. So you've got all of this expanse. I did The Sound of Music 3 times out there, and that was glorious because you started Maria, the young novitiate was what I played, and she was on top of the mountain and came running all the way down the mountain across the big stage in the back, and then down over a bridge, over the moat, and then down onto the main stage where the orchestra was singing The Sound of Music. So it was like being in the Alps, and it looked like the Alps, and all outside. And it was wonderful. And you were changing your clothes behind a tree. You know, you never went back to your dressing room ever, except at intermission. And Guy Lombardo it was his theater. He was the producer. And every night he brought his speedboat, those wonderful speedboats that he had, wood cruiser boats. And he would bring it in for the Star Spangled Banner. And then the show would start. And I took my children, I rented a house on Long Island, and my son would go away to camp. And my daughter was in The King and I with me 1 year. And I love the fact that Maureen was so good. Opening night, we rehearsed on the subway going home at night. And I was worrying about her because she hadn't been on stage before. And opening night, God, she was just wonderful. And every now and then there would be a dry, empty space of open air. And I'd think, oh, it's Maureen, she forgot her line. And then it wasn't her, it was me. I was so worried about her that I forgot my line. And the dead space was mine. But she was wonderful. And so I had her in the show with me, which was great fun. And I loved that. And then just having the kids out where we could play out and water ski in the daytime and go to Fire Island and see people for lunch and things, and then come back and do a show. It was a dream place to work. I loved it. And some days it rained, and those days if it really rained, you didn't go on. And other times it might be blustery and you did go on. And we did The King and I out there, John Cullum and I was going up over a bridge on a very blustery, early kind of pre-hurricane moment on Long Island. And I was going up and the wind got under that hoop skirt and lifted me up. And if John Cullum hadn't taken my hand, I think I would have been Mary Poppins sailing over Long Island Sound. I was on my way. And then one night also in the scene where the king is about to beat Tuptim, the slave, and Mrs. Anna steps forward and says, "No, Your Majesty," and stops him. I stepped forward and stepped into the skirt, fell flat on my face, and the whole hoop skirt went over my head. And I was just lying there with the hoop skirt over my head and my pantalettes out the back and 2 shoes. And John Cullum started to laugh, and he just put the whip down and left the stage. So we had some wonderful moments out there. And in The King and I, or in the Sound of Music, Christopher Hewitt and Michael King. Christopher played Max, my friend. And I always had that moment when, at the end of Do a Deer, when Maria would go, do, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re. And take a big breath, and all the kids took the breath with me, and then she'd go, do. And then they would laugh, and it was the end of the scene. And the last night of the show, that last night of the season, Christopher, who is just an inveterate prankster, had a whoopee cushion, and I went do, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, and you heard this, and the children just exploded, and so did I, and so did the audience. And the producer came running backstage and he said, "Who did that? You're fired." And we all said, "Too late, this is the last night." So Jones Beach was, oh gosh, that was a dream engagement. That was wonderful.
Magda Katz, why don't you ask your question?
How did the ambassadorship happen? How was your husband tapped to be ambassador?
Ronald Reagan had been president of the Screen Actors Guild. And then a few years later, my husband was president of the Screen Actors Guild. And they knew each other. And President Reagan's best friend, Bill Clark, who was chief of staff, and then he was the Secretary of the Interior, but he was Judge Clark, he was a judge. And he was with him in Sacramento, and then he went to Washington with him. And he knew my husband, he knew him from prep school and knew of his knowledge of Mexico and Latin America and his talent. And so when they were selecting ambassadors, Ronald Reagan said, you know, Bill Clark suggested it to him. He said, you know, I think that's an excellent suggestion. And he called my husband and asked him if he would consider being appointed to being the United States ambassador to Mexico. And of course, Jack, that was a dream he had when he was 7 years old. He told his mother he wanted to be the ambassador, US ambassador to Mexico. And it was just a dream come true. And that's how it happened. And it was wonderful for him that he had that relationship with Ronald Reagan, because some ambassadors, the ambassador is supposed to be the president's friend and supposed to be able to pick up a phone and take a problem to the president. And sometimes ambassadors don't have that luxury of that kind of a relationship. And Jack really did. He knew him well and loved him. And I loved Ronald Reagan too. He was just so special.
Thank you.
All right, I have a question here from Kristen. Have you seen Hamilton or any of the current Broadway shows? And if you have, what did you think of them? How has Broadway changed over the years?
Well, no, I have not seen Hamilton. And I missed it on television even. So I have that project to go see it. I was a little upset when they took the vice president to task from the stage. I thought that was not exactly an actor's duty when they're performing to do that. But I haven't seen Hamilton, and I would like to see it. The thing that I feel about Broadway, what happened, and it made me sad, is that it became a theater of sound. You know, you had all of this blasting of sound at you, and then people who couldn't really project their voices had microphones. And so you were getting not the pure human voice, but you were getting a manufactured sound, an amplified sound. So it took some of the artistry away from it. And I remember being in London, and I went to the theater, and I sat there and I actually started to cry because I realized that the actors were projecting, that they didn't have microphones. They were actually speaking in a good theatrical projected human voice. And it kind of just hit you because it was a real sound. It was a human sound. So I'm sorry that that's happened to Broadway. I long for more intimate shows. You know, I'd love to see them go back to doing shows that are like I Do. It's a very simple show, but it says so much, and you have a Mary Martin or a Robert Preston on stage who are great artists. And that's really theatrical entertainment. I'd like to see it maybe go back a little bit in that direction. But you can't stop progress, and you can't stop what's coming in the future. And so it'll be interesting to see after the pandemic and when Broadway starts up again, what it will be.
All right, Walter Willison asked to ask you about Helena Cassadine.
We did.
What would you like to know about this lady? She's the most powerful woman in the world. She is the richest woman in the world. She is the cruelest woman in the world, but you kind of love her because she has an Achilles heel, which is her weakness is her grandson. And she can't stand it when anything happens that's going to endanger him, and she doesn't think it through and she makes a mistake. And so she gets embroiled in kind of iffy situations because she's trying to help him. And she also likes young men. So that gets her in trouble once in a while, which is fun to play. And I don't know how they'll do that with the pandemic. I just, you can't do anything intimate at all. But she's a challenging, wonderful powerful character that everybody fears. Even the actors on the show don't like to have a scene with me because I'll go into their office and have a scene with them, and when I leave, they're dead. So they'll say, you know, keep her away from me. I don't need to act with her.
Lee Pfeiffer, why don't you unmute and ask your question?
Is somebody?
Yes, Ms. Towers. I'm among the many film journalists, like my friend and colleague Foster Hirsch, who tried unsuccessfully to get interviews with John Gavin over the years.
Uh-oh.
But some years ago, Cubby Broccoli asked me to write an official history of the James Bond films.
Mm-hmm.
And what most people don't know is that had Sean Connery not returned to the series for Diamonds Are Forever, John Gavin was going to be James Bond in that film.
That's right.
So can you discuss that a little bit? Because I always wanted to get a few quotes from him on it. He never discussed it publicly. Just for everyone knows, Sean Connery played James Bond. He quit in 1967 after 5 films. George Lazenby played it one time, then he quit, and they couldn't get Connery back, so they were going to hire John Gavin when at the last minute, Connery came back for the highest salary ever paid to an actor, $1.25 million, I believe at that time. So what was his feelings about that? Would he have played Bond?
Oh, yes. And he was really deeply disappointed that that didn't work. He would have loved that. I think he would have been a great Bond because he had all the qualities. He was wonderful looking. He had the elegance and that kind of attitude that some Bonds have had, certainly that Sean Connery had. That I just think he would have been a very interesting Bond. But what happened, his comment, he was reading the paper one day and he saw in a column that Sean Connery was getting divorced. And he said, you know what? I bet I don't play 007. He's going to have to come because he's getting a divorce. He's going to have to come back and do it again because of the money. And that's exactly what happened. So Sean Connery came back and played the next Bond film.
You think he was intimidated by having to play a British, something that's so quintessentially British? Did that pose a challenge to him, do you think?
I'm sure it was a challenge, but I don't think he felt that it was a challenge he couldn't meet. He was excited and God, he was really ready to do it. And as I say, he was bitterly disappointed when it didn't happen. And he still gets residuals. He didn't do it, but every time that film plays, he gets a residual. Isn't that interesting?
Thank you.
I don't know.
I've been waiting many years to get that answer. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay.
I'm sure he would have enjoyed that question too.
He wouldn't take it. I couldn't get through to him. I'm glad you answered it. Thank you so much.
All right, Foster, it's back to you.
Okay, Connie, are you still singing?
Am I still singing? Of course. I have my pianist comes and we work out, and I have a singing teacher in New York City, Rosamond Hirschhorn, and I take a lesson from her every now and then. And so we do this on the telephone, and it's wonderful because it keeps me in voice, and I do have hopes of maybe doing something singing. I just don't know what it will be, whether it's maybe something that I have done before that I'd like to kind of try it out again. It's called It's a Long Way from Whitefish, Montana. And it's a musical autobiographical hour where I talk about my grandmother and sing a little Irish song and in Gaelic. And then I talk about all the people. I don't talk about myself, but I talk about John Ford, John Wayne, William Holden, Richard Rogers, who was just the dearest friend in the world to me, and George Abbott, and all of the things that you've heard today are many stories. And then I talk about Mexico and my experience with the orphans in Mexico when we had that tragic earthquake in 1985. So
you may do it if there's an opportunity.
Yeah, exactly.
But the good news is you're not remotely retired. You'll never retire. You're busy all the time.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And I want to be.
And you want to be. Wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Dealing with this lovely Constance Towers. Wasn't it wonderful spending this time?
Oh, well, to you, I'm just so, I love the Lambs Club. I just think you're wonderful. So it was great fun for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
I
on
love you. I
On
love you,
behalf,
Foster.
behalf of the Lambs, we thank you for doing this. And also, again, a shout out to my partner in crime here, Magda Katz. Magda, who do we have coming up next?
First, I'd like to thank Ms. Towers. It was phenomenal. And Mark, thank you for being there for me all the time. And of course, Foster. We couldn't do this without Foster. Our next is Catherine Russell, the jazz singer. She's an incredible jazz singer. And then we will have a book about Jerome Robbins on the 14th. And then October 1st, we'll have Julian Mills. So that I hope you all come back to us and, you know, get in touch with the Lambs if you want to hear more about the club and more about what we're doing.
And on the emails you all receive with your information, you'll see links to the Lambs if you're so interested in making a small donation to keep us alive. I also want to, of course, I've got to thank our friend Foster, who is our newest Lamb. We made him a Lamb a few weeks ago, I think it was. Thanks for all his support of the organization all these years. And with that, I thank you all for attending, and
Thank
we'll
you.
see
Thank
you
you so
again.
much. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Have a great night at the Lamb.
Thank you.
Bye.
And you will find this interview up on the Lambs website tomorrow afternoon.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye all.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Foster.
Bye, Connie. We'll talk.
Bye.
Thank you, Connie. Thank